I want to, before saying a few things about the film before the screening, just mention a couple of upcoming events that are being presented in the Lenfest Center by the School of the Arts. So on October 21st, Professor Annette Insdorf will present 2 films by Polish filmmaker Wojciech Haas called Codes at 3:30 p.m. and An Uneventful Story at 7:15 p.m. on October 21st. And Professor Insdorf will also be signing copies of her new book, Intimations, the Cinema of Wojciech Haas. Other upcoming events will be taking place with David Henry Hwang and Julie Taymor around Madame Butterfly, and with Carolee Schneeman and the art historian Brendan Joseph and Laura Poitras. I think that there's room available in all of those events, so we encourage you to come back for those. So why Cinema of Resistance? Why did we pick that for the theme of the film series this year? It's probably self-evident to most of you. It goes without saying that the theme is topical in the current American political context. And one of the reasons we wanted to offer this series was to provide you with some examples from other times and places of different forms of resistance to oppressive political regimes. And also to think about how these stories of resistance are shaped and told through cinema, as well as through fiction, memoir, and history, and all of these notes are actually present in tonight's film. Of course, in the French context, the term resistance evokes immediately and above all resistance to the Nazis in occupied France during World War II, and that's the theme of tonight's film, Army of Shadows, made by Jean-Pierre Melville in 1969. And so I also want to mention that tomorrow, October 20th, 2017, would be Melville's 100th birthday, so this is a nice tribute to him as well. So just a few words about the film before we see it. I think this will help your reading of the film. It is about 2 hours and 20 minutes long, and so it's a long film. And we hope that you'll be able to stay afterwards for a discussion with Professors Robert Paxton and Richard Peña. So we'll have about a 30-minute discussion after the film as well. Army of Shadows is based on a book by the same name that was published in 1943 by Joseph Kessel, who was a member of the French Resistance. He was in London at the time, and the book was published in Algiers. And the book was inspired by real people and real events, but these had to be obscured, of course, because it was published during the war. So the real identities and real information had to be obscured, and it was told, therefore, in a fictionalized form. But Kessel said everything had to be accurate, and at the same time, nothing must be recognizable. But the movie also draws very much on the experience of Melville himself. Not only the experience, but the perspective of Melville, who was also a member of the Resistance. As New York film critic Amy Tobin put it, Army of Shadows has the quality of lived experience like no other film in Melville's oeuvre. And Melville said to his biographer about the film, "For the first time, I show things that I have seen, that I have experienced." Melville's real name was Jean-Pierre Grumbach, and he was born into a comfortable Jewish family in France. He adopted Melville as his nom de plume, or nom de caméra, when he was in the Resistance, and then kept it as his director's name afterwards. He wanted to be a director from a very young age, and watched in particular a lot of American cinema. But he joined the army in 1937 at age 20. So he was in the army for several years and then joined the Resistance early on during the war. He went to London in 1943 and he was mobilized in Italy in 1944. Melville read Kessel's book when he went to London in 1943, where he also read Vercors Le Silence de la Mer, The Silence of the Sea, which would in fact become the subject of the first fiction film that he made shortly after the war. So a few things for you to be thinking about as you're watching this movie. One, think about the fact that the book was written in 1943 and the movie is set in 1943. So that this is a time when Germany has by then occupied all of France. The United States is in the war, but the outcome of the war is still very much uncertain. And that means that the actions and sacrifices of the men and women depicted in this film are made without them knowing whether those actions and sacrifices will make any difference. Without knowing whether or not resistance has a point and whether or not their side will win. So think about that as you're watching this film. Think also about the fact that it's made in 1969. So what does that mean? It's short, just a few months after de Gaulle has left power in the wake of May '68. It's also at a time when the understanding of Vichy is, and the nature of the Vichy regime is not what it is today. It's before The Sorrow and the Pity came out. Marcel Ofus's film came out in 1971 about collaboration. It's before Robert Paxton's groundbreaking work on Vichy France was published in French translation in English in 1972 and in France in 1973. So the understanding of the Vichy regime in 1969 was not at all what it is today. And finally, I want to invite you to reflect as you watch Army of Shadows about the difference between looking back later at a tragic time in history, in this case Europe under the Nazis, when we know what the outcome was. We know clearly who the heroes were and who was on the right side of history. What's the difference between looking back and living through history as it's still unfolding? It's much harder, I think, to make moral judgments and to take personal risks and make sacrifices like those made by the characters in this film when we're in the middle of history as it's still happening. So remember that in wartime France, it's difficult to estimate exactly, but only about 2% of the population was actually resisting, and a couple percent were active collaborators. Mostly, people did not resist. They got by, they went about their lives, they waited to see how things would turn out. So, something to think about as you watch Army of Shadows. Thanks so much to all of you for coming. So, I'm here with Professor Robert Paxton and Professor Richard Peña. I think you probably all know who both of them are, but just in case, Professor Paxton is Mellon Professor Emeritus of Social Sciences at Columbia University, and is, of course, the author of several very important works on Vichy, Vichy France and Vichy les Juifs, Vichy and the Jews, published in 1972 and 1981, and translated shortly thereafter into French. He's also an expert on fascism and has published a number of books on fascism in Europe as well. Professor Richard Peña is a professor of professional practice in film at the School of the Arts. He was for 25 years the program director of the Film Society at Lincoln Center and the director of the New York Film Festival. And he's organized a number of festivals and retrospectives on a broad range of directors and national cinemas, and is, among other things, very knowledgeable about French cinema. So thank you both for being here with us this evening. And so I'm going to start with a few questions for Professor Paxton from a more historical perspective about this film. When it came out in 1969, it was actually not very well received at first, and there was a review in the Cahiers du Cinéma, for example, that said that this was a very Gaullist film. So I wanted to ask you if you could comment a little bit about why it would be portrayed as a Gaullist film in 1969 and what that would mean in that context.
Well, so this is on, I take it. You can hear me. Well, of course, we see General de Gaulle very briefly, and then we see him from behind as a kind of godlike figure. And oddly enough, his intelligence chief plays himself in the movie. So this is, it almost looks like an in-house production from that point of view. Everything tends toward London. The reports are London, the arms come from London, people go back and forth to London. In reality, de Gaulle had a very difficult time gaining control over the internal resistance movements that presented him, because he was living comfortably in London and they were suffering, and they thought they were there first. And it was the person that Luc Jardy represents, or one of the people represents, Jean Moulin, who came over and by miracles of negotiation got all the resistance movements to join an organization and recognize the authority of de Gaulle. And he died under torture in that very building. You saw the military hospital in Lyon, which is today a museum of the resistance. And so it's Gaullist orthodoxy is very much present in the film. In 1969, the young people of France had just risen in May '68 against the established order. De Gaulle had left his office as president, or was about to leave. For the moment, he was no longer a great hero, but a figure of old-fashioned, worn-out authority. And so the timing was terrible.
And what about the role of communism in the film? He was also Melville was also said to be anti-communist, and he called himself an anarcho-feudalist, I believe. But we know, of course, that the Communist Party played a very important role in the resistance. What do you have to say about the portrayal of, or not, of communism in this film?
Well, there are only two. One of the curious things about this film is how devoid of ideological or political content it is. The novel, Joseph Kessel's novel, is highly political, and in that scene where they're all sitting around waiting to be shot, each one makes his declaration of faith. They tell where they come from. In the film, it's brilliant. There's not a word. They had this gesture of solidarity. They toss the cigarettes around, but not a word. You don't know anything about these people's ideology, about their motives. It's taken for granted. Only two movements are mentioned: the communists and the Cagoule, the right-wing military conspiracy of the late 39 that the Baron Valois was his name, wonderful name, a caricature of a right-wing French baron. Those are the only two, and there were people from that movement that were in the resistance. It's quite legitimate. And the young man in the first camp, of course, announces himself as a communist. We don't hear anything more about it. That's, of course, a gigantic issue. In the first year of the war, the Communist Party did not play a role in the resistance. The underground Humanité said, fraternize with German soldiers. We are against both Wall Street in the City of London and the great industries of the Ruhr. It's the same fight. We're for peace. And then, of course, Hitler made his major mistake in June 1941, attacked the Soviet Union. The Communist Party rushed into resistance in a 24-hour turnaround. They were superbly equipped for it. They were already underground, and they came to dominate it. But none of that is in the movie, as is any other parts of the political history of the resistance. Is just swept away in favor of something much more profound.
You commented on the fact that in the scene where the cigarettes are passed around, we don't learn anything about the past of the people who are there, and that apparently is one of the changes that Melville made to the book by really removing personal information, not only about them but about the other the members of the réseau. We don't know anything about their
politics,
about their background,
about their politics and ideology in general.
Right.
It's just simply taken for granted. It's not spelled out.
And so there's a kind of depersonalization of the members of this resistance réseau. And I think interestingly, the one slip up that Mathilde makes is to keep the photograph of her daughter,
Yes.
and that's both her downfall and what ultimately leads to their need to eliminate her. So that keeping a link to part of one's personal past is actually very dangerous, and that's not emphasized in the film.
That's so.
Can you tell us a little bit about how you think the depictions of the acts of resistance that we see in this film, how closely how accurate they are historically? I mean, what the scene of the submarine and the scene of of London and the Free French, and how close are these scenes to what might actually have occurred?
Well, I think Melville made an extraordinary effort for authenticity, including having Colonel Passy played himself. And there's a great deal of those cars that work with the fumes of a coal boiler, for example. There's a great deal of period stuff in there. There's a lot of sort of surface authenticity. And we see various kinds of resistance activity: the submarine, the Lysander aircraft that can take off in the Baron's vegetable garden, and a lot of the business about changing residences and so forth is very authentic, extremely careful about its period exactness, but it's a highly selected view of the resistance. There are a great many aspects of the French resistance that aren't there. The journalism, for example. In Joseph Kessel's book, he spends a lot of time on it, and he has a list of the titles. I think the Bibliothèque Nationale lists 215 clandestine newspapers that came out in a huge effort to rival the Germans' propaganda machine and to give people a true idea of what's going on in the war. Nor is there, because this is a film made from the point of view of 43, we don't yet see the concrete things the resistance did related to the planning for D-Day. Almost all the information that General Eisenhower had about German forces came from the French resistance. That's what those radios were for. On D-Day itself, the resistance, according to an elaborate plan, went into action and blew up all the bridges and railroads and roads and so forth leading into Normandy, and the reinforcement, German reinforcements took weeks to get there. It was an extremely important contribution, and General Eisenhower says in his memoirs it was worth 15 divisions. So if you saw this film without knowing anything about the resistance, you might think, well, it was heroic but foolish bravery and it didn't lead to anything. But in fact, it didn't do as much as some people claim. There's a certain amount of exaggeration in some of the resistance memoirs, but it had an important effect, and it played a role in liberation, and it was a way in which the French got their pride back after the terrible defeat of 1940.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the character of Le Patron? And
Yes.
he represents a combination of a couple different people. You want to tell us more about that?
Many of the people in this film are drawn upon actual people. As I say, there was a considerable effort here for historical accuracy. The wonderful art-loving intellectual we see at the beginning is modeled on two people. He's modeled on a professor of mathematical logic named Jean Cavaillès. And the books you see being handled are the actual books of Jean Cavaillès with the name of Luc Jardy on them. Jean Cavaillès was one of the first, perhaps the first French person to be be memorialized at Yad Vashem. He died under torture. He was an incredibly brilliant mathematician. At 37, he was a full professor at the Sorbonne. And his role in resistance was supposed to be that of an administrator and a planner, and he would have none of it. He wanted to get his hands dirty. He wanted to go out and blow things up. He apparently even got into one of the submarine pens on the coast of France. And of course he was caught and tortured to death. So he's one of the people. The other person is Jean Moulin. He was a prefect, which is like a governor, only appointed by the state. And he was the only high civil servant who joined de Gaulle. And I mentioned his mission. De Gaulle sent him in 43 to get the quarreling and independent-minded little groups like this little group to come together and recognize his authority and form a central committee to plan and so forth. And he was betrayed by someone who was exactly in the situation of Mathilde, someone who had been in German captivity and got out, and he wasn't supposed to come to the meeting with Jean Moulin, but he came anyway, and of course he was being followed, and Moulin was arrested and tortured to death. No one knows exactly when, but shortly before this film was made in 1964, de Gaulle put what may have been his remains in the Pantheon in a great public ceremony of national unity around the resistance, which is, again, part of the idea here that this is almost a Gaullist piece of Gaullist work, though it isn't really that.
So one last question, then I'll turn to Richard. What references did you pick up in the film to Pétain and Pétainism, and what did you make of those references?
Well, I had thought there was only one, and that was on the wall of the barber shop. And of course, when he sees that, his heart sinks because he thinks he's got a Pétainist barber with his razor on his Adam's apple. And on the contrary, he has someone who's going to help him. And indeed, we don't meet anybody, we don't meet any living collaborators in this film, which is one way in which it is not historically accurate. The douanier, I mean, everybody is sympathetic to the resistance in this film, and that, of course, is a construct. But there's another one, and that is on the wall of the commander of the prison camp. He had also a portrait of Pétain. But we see two portraits of Pétain, and then we have the colonel who says Pétain is an idiot, Jean Foutre. But we never meet any collaborators except the police, who of course are essential, because the Germans, we now know, had a terrible manpower problem. They didn't have enough troops to fight off the Russians, who were infinitely more numerous. And they stripped France bare of any able-bodied man. You'll be surprised, but the occupation troops in Bordeaux were Hindus. They were Indian prisoners. They used everything they possibly could to keep France going, and they had all of 3,000 police. I think you've already said that. For all of France, they had to have the French police, and the Vichy government thought that gave them some leverage to get some privileges, and so they had a deal. The Germans would let the French police do their own thing and have a certain independence, and the French police would arrest the enemies of the Germans, that is to say, resistors and Jews. So we see the French police doing a lot of the arresting, which is absolutely accurate. So we see the Vichy state an accomplice of the occupation and an accomplice eventually of the Holocaust, but we don't see any collaborators.
Okay, thank you very much. And now we'll turn to Richard Peña. Can I start by asking you to comment maybe on the opening sequence of the film, which I understand Melville had a hard time knowing whether he should put it at the beginning or at the end of the film, and at the last minute decided to move it from the end back to the beginning.
You're talking about when he's in the car talking to the policeman?
No, talking about the image of the Arc de Triomphe and the Nazis arriving and then turning towards the camera, that scene.
Well, I think it obviously sets the stage that we're in occupied France. So, I mean, in that way, it seems like a reasonably good thing to do. You usually want your very beginning people to know exactly where you are. So it starts the film off with the most essential piece of information, that in France, when you see these troops and you see the Arc de Triomphe, you understand what's going on.
Right. Maybe you can comment a little bit about the title, The Army of Shadows, and the role of light and shadows in the film.
One of the things, I mean, in something that you sent me, of course, you probably know that Jean-Pierre Melville was best known really for some very intelligent and very elegant gangster films or crime films. I mean, Bob le Flambeur, Le Samurai, Le Dulot, things like that. And in a way, what's among the many interesting things about this film is how much he reimagines the resistance in those terms. I mean, essentially, this is kind of a criminal organization. Criminal organization doing good, one could say, it's fighting resistance, but like a criminal organization, it has codes, it has conventions, it has, hierarchies. Everything that you find in his gangster films, you find here. So it's almost as if he took the sort of metaphor of the underworld, which is what is the underworld? A world that exists around us that we don't see. So in a certain way, the resistance becomes that. It becomes this sort of invisible world that exists alongside the visible world at the same time.
And how about, can you talk a little bit about the use of color in the film? It almost looks like it's a black and white film. In fact, in my memory after seeing it, I thought of it as a black and white film. How is color used?
Well, I mean, again, one senses this atmosphere of dreariness. There's a kind of oppressiveness that one gets just walking down the street. There's never a feeling of just a sunny day or something like that. So the atmosphere that France has, being under this heavy load of occupation, is really felt visually in terms of, I think, the way that color is muted, skies are generally dark. I mean, there's very little life. The only time there is any is when he goes to, I guess, the YWCA dance, where suddenly there's some color, light, movement, and it really sticks out in a way. And he seems so uncomfortable there. You know, he doesn't seem like, oh, now I can have a good time. He seems truly sort of, you know, fish out of water or somewhere very not at ease being in such an atmosphere. Perhaps knowing, of course, what the situation is back in France.
That's interesting. I didn't see him as being ill at ease there. I saw him as sort of standing at a distance and watching these young people who were dancing in spite of the bombing that's going on around them, and almost impervious to it, which seemed like a sort of act of resistance in and of itself. So it's interesting. I had a different sort of
I
response to
didn't
that.
see him at all joining in, talking to anybody. I mean, he keeps
Right.
very much his
He definitely
distance
keeps a distance.
from all that. One thing I wanted to mention, though, I wanted to ask Professor Paxton about it. You know, I always like to think of films in dialogue with other films, and it's remarkable the same year that this film came out, another great film about the resistance came out, and that's The Sorrow and the Pity. And, you know, the dialogue between these two, I think maybe shows up perhaps why it is a Gaullist film in lots of ways. Because I do think it's a Gaullist film in that, you know, what de Gaulle wanted to do is eliminate any difference among the French. All of France was resisting. You know, it was French resistance. And indeed, as Professor Paxton has shown well in his work, there were enormous numbers of fighting groups and things like that. And of course, I think Sorrow and the Pity offers a very different vision of a France, especially in the early years of the occupation, one that succumbed to it, that accepted it in large part, and whatever. So it was one of the first real blows against what you might think of the myth of the resistance in that way.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. It's hard to imagine two films more totally at cross purposes. Ophir's film was designed to demolish all the pieties, not only the Gaullist myth of the resistance and of the huge French role the French had played in their own liberation, but every established aspect of established order, the authority of the father, the role of the family, the role of religion, the sexual mores, the whole thing, with brilliant interviews in which he catches people, traps people into revealing that they had been either collaborators or at best neutral or self-serving way during the early years of the occupation. Whereas this film, without ever being overtly, without ever having an ideological discourse, is of course predicated upon unity, duty, loyalty, devotion to the cause, even if it makes you do terrible things like killing your associates.
And the thing is, the film is tremendously de-dramatized. I mean, there are no great moments hardly any great moments that we see people escape. I mean, when they escape, they just escape. I mean, there's no kind of shootouts or things. And it makes me feel that after a while, that really what Melville achieves in an interesting way is the resistance as a state of being.
Yes.
It's less a series of actions, it's less a kind of real political, military intervention, as it is just a state of being. And in that way, I think of it as kind of a Sartrean film in that way. It kind of feels very much
it's
kind of existential.
There's almost a no-exit policy about it, but it seemed to me that he wanted to peel away all of the sort of superficial resistance stories about blowing up trains and focus upon the essential, which he deals with in a rather abstract way, which is the drama of trying to survive with death at your very doorstep. And so you've got, and that is a very authentic portrayal of what it must have been like for these guys at the top who'd already been identified.
There's extraordinary dullness. I mean, there's
there's a great deal of waiting. There's a great deal of waiting in this film. There's a great deal of stasis, and what's there is raw fear. And there's this clash between the idealism they act on and yet the terrible things they have to do. And there's loyalty to each other, but these are play out in a very, very abstract, it's almost like a Greek tragedy, abstract qualities are playing out, and they are authentic, but they're not the usual resistance stories.
Right.
So you used the word tragedy. And I wanted to ask both of you if you think this is a film that offers a heroic portrayal of the resistance, or a tragic portrayal, or both, or something different.
You know, it's hard to see in terms of what he shows us the heroism. I mean, in a sense, it's that state of being. I think Professor Paxton described it beautifully. I mean, in lots of ways, it's a dull film. Not much happens. People are sitting around waiting. But what are they waiting for? Death. Death is really all around them. It's kind of like really what defines their lives is the proximity of death. So in that way, it becomes kind of a very scary look at a form of life in that way. Also, I think the film clearly is set at a time before, quote unquote, the resistance really got going in terms of, as far as my understanding of it. It was really, mid 43 or something that they really begin kind of the operations that begin actually hurting the German war effort and things like that. Prior to that, it was a very clandestine kind of movement, small things, rescues, things like, especially of flyers. That was a big part of it. But my understanding is that he deliberately set it at a time when there would be less opportunity to show that more heroic, more militant side, perhaps, of the resistance. Does the novel go further? I've never read the novel. Does the novel end like this?
Yes, the novel. Well, the novel was written in '43, so it can't go beyond '43. And the film, in one way, is updated on the novel. The novel never mentions the Maquis, and this brings in the Maquis at the very end. The Maquis is the experience of going into the forest, and it came about because in February 1943, at German orders, Vichy restored the military draft, but it was not to join the army, it was to go and work in German factories. And it was extremely unpopular, and thousands of young men took to the forests, or took to the underbrush. Maquis is the word for the, it would be called chaparral in California. It's a coastal underbrush, and hid out there and provided the actual troops for the organized resistance groups that later on tried to hold parts of France. None of them succeeded against German force, but they did make themselves a nuisance and really put a dent in the occupation. But that's mentioned in here. It's not mentioned in the book.
So maybe one last question, and then we'll open up to some questions from the audience for Professor Peña. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the actors in the film, Lino Ventura, and his sort of portrayal of masculinity, and maybe comment a little bit about the use of body language and of looks, regard, in the absence of a lot of dialogue with regards to his acting style?
Well, again, they're a wonderful group of actors, and one of the things that I think Army of Shadows, for me, is one of its most wonderful qualities. It really is a film that's sort of one of the last films of the great studio era of French filmmaking. Already by the 1960s, this looked a little bit stylistically like a dinosaur. The French New Wave had come in, there was all kinds of, location shooting and made-up scripts and whatever. And here's a very classical film with obviously an extremely concise and well-structured script. The entire thing just about shot in studios and stuff like that with very kind of intricate lighting patterns. And these are all the stars. Lino Ventura was somebody who had been a big star of French cinema since about the mid-50s. Simone Signoret was again another major star of the cinema. So part of the Cahiers rejection, I think there are a lot of aspects to it, was still rejecting that old style French cinema. That certainly by 1969, the new wave had almost come and gone by 1969. So in a certain way, this film looks like a throwback to something much earlier. And these, if you're going to do a film like that, and that was of course Melville's style, you have in it the people who literally were the stars and major figures of those films.
Melville said something to the effect that he didn't know if his own films would still be around in 50 years, and in fact he thought maybe cinema would disappear altogether in 50 years, which would be like by 2020, we're almost there. Do you think this film holds up well? It was only released in the United States for the first time in 2006. There was a retrospective, I think, at Film Forum this summer for the 100-year anniversary of his birth, with very laudatory reviews. How do you think the film holds up at this remove?
No, I think it holds up well. I think it does everything Melville set out to do. One might disagree with it. One might say this is a very kind of particular vision of the resistance and whatever. But again, in the same way that I think Melville's crime films aren't really about crime. You know, they're about lots of other things, and they're set in the world of crime to accent that. I sort of feel that this film, at its heart, is not really about the resistance. It's about a lot of other kinds of things that interest Melville: loyalty, codes, forms of conduct, male groups. I mean, these were all the things that run through his films. And this gave him a great occasion to sort of make a film like that. But I don't particularly think he has a comment to make on the resistance. You know, he wasn't really that kind of filmmaker, I think.
Thank you very much. We can open up to a few questions from the audience, and if you could try to keep your questions concise and questions rather than commentary, that would be great. In the back row?
Yes, one of the opening scenes presents the main character about being released or taken for interrogation.
Is there a microphone to pass around? I'm having a hard time hearing.
I can hear you, sir.
Okay.
I could hear you.
Go ahead. Richard can hear you.
That's right.
As he's leaving the compound where he's been detained, right? He goes through a listing of the different nationalities that are in the camp and by extension are part of the resistance. The Czechs, the Poles, the Romanians, the Jews, the Russians, the Spaniards, the Jews of many nationalities, etc., etc. And I felt that it is like a passing comment on the reality, on the question of how French was the French resistance. Because the French resistance was filled with other nationalities that had been displaced. Many, for instance, and I know for personal reasons, were Spanish Republicans.
Yes.
And that was the only way they could survive.
Yes.
How was that articulated in the film? What was the purpose of putting that scene there, which it really stands out in comparison with a very personalistic, close-knit relationships? The only time you see masses of people in any way.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And I think that historical scholarship has come along since then. I kind of doubt that Melville was this would not have been a part of the Gaullist orthodoxy that all these people are. I believe it simply is another reflection of the vastness of the German power that has rounded up all of these people from all over Europe. For a long time, the official version was the resistance was a French thing, French people rising against the occupation, and of course a great many French people couldn't really bring themselves to do the terrible things that you have to do. Whereas many people who were living in France and whose bridges had been burned in one way or another, including Jewish refugees, a great number of Spanish refugees, as you mentioned, made up huge numbers of the active resistance units. Scholarship has brought this out. It's not a lesson that's terribly popular in France, but it's absolutely true. I'm just not sure that's what Melville meant. That's what we know now. I think he simply wanted to show that this is a world war and that the Germans are everywhere, and it's another announcement of the great power of the occupier.
There's actually a film called The Army of Crime by Robert Paxton, which is exactly about this, about the very earliest days of the resistance and how it was, as you mentioned, very, very largely foreigners. And again, because they were Spanish exiles, they were Jews, they were Germans who had left Nazi Germany. So a lot of them were in there. But I think, as Professor Paxton pointed out, there are sort of stages of the resistance. And I think that was a very preliminary stage. We're watching, I think, the second stage, and then the third is the Maquis stage, when many more people joined in.
Yes, question here?
One thing puzzles me about the film. One
We've got
particular
a microphone.
moment.
Let's use the mic.
There's one moment in the film that keeps puzzling me. The fact that there was no conversation between the brothers in the rowboat.
It's dark.
I don't think they recognize each other. I don't think they saw or recognized each other.
I think that's a very poignant part because they never knew. I guess Jean-Francois never stopped believing that his brother was this aesthete living in Paris. It's one of the chances.
One of the most tragic moments in the
Yes,
film.
yes, they pass each other, they can't see.
And again, I think that's part of the codes that, that Melville is so fascinated by, that in this situation, they're not brothers at all. You know, this man at the head of the resistance, this guy's a foot soldier.
Right.
And
The
so
apex and the base of the
so they don't really, you know, as I said, there's a lot, if you go through Melville's films, you'll see lots of things where people who are friends related suddenly drop that because in the situation, that's not what the convention calls for.
Yes, question back there.
Thank you. First, my great-grandfather, who volunteered for World War I, was a general during World War II and led the resistance after losing the war in Val-de-Marne. He was tortured by Gestapo and then deported to Mauthausen in Austria, and he survived. So it was very emotional for me to see this movie, and it's also very emotional for me to see you for the first time, Mr. Paxton, because I've read all your books and they are all absolutely amazing. And you are, I believe, the most consequential historian in French history.
You're supposed to ask a question and not make a comment.
I'm sorry, but I wanted to say that because because you are the most consequential historian in French recent history in the 20th century. There is still a lot of debates about you, and there is still a lot of critiques, and every year there is a new critique coming out, and all the time. And you probably know them, and one of the most important one was a couple of years, or maybe 2 years ago, when Éric Zemmour, who is a far-right thinker, he wrote a book, and the chapter was called Robert Paxton, Our Ground
Okay,
Master.
can we keep this
And yes,
short?
yes,
And the question, please.
Okay, and then he said basically that Vichy actually tried to save the French Jews in exchange of the foreign Jews, and he asked the question why Robert Paxton never questioned the fact that 90% of the French Jews survived the war, and why can it not explain that? And it was very interesting because historians were, and so. Okay, I'm going to stop there, but what is your opinion on that? And would you say, or would you see any positive act that Vichy France tried to save the French Jews against the foreign Jews?
I'm
This gets us
actually
away
going to
from the
take my
film.
prerogative as
It gets us-
moderator and say that's not really central to a discussion of the film, and it's a really long question. So I think I'm going to give Professor Paxton a pass on responding to that
We
question.
can
If you
talk
don't
about
mind, we
it
can talk about it
privately,
afterwards.
Yeah.
Okay, we have
But-
time for 2 more questions. Here.
So this is both because Professor Paxton mentioned earlier that there was no ideology really in the film. Oh, do you need a mic? Do you need a mic?
Speak. I can hear you.
Oh, sorry.
You speak clearly.
And then Professor Peña's last comment was that maybe this isn't really a film about the resistance. And I'm kind of curious because I didn't really notice much about what people were resisting against.
Exactly.
You saw a portrait of Himmler and Heydrich, but you didn't really hear
Yeah,
any
sure.
conversation about the Nazis themselves or about the occupation itself. So I'm wondering what you make of that. Any further comments about that specifically?
Well, one thing you could say is that for a French audience, they knew what the occupation was. So in a certain way, there was a certain shorthand that perhaps Melville was depending on. But, you know, I would, I guess, just expand what I said before. And when I say it's not about the resistance, I mean, if we look at Westerns, I mean, there are Westerns, say, by, you know, directors like Anthony Mann. I don't think Anthony Mann's really saying anything about the development and growth of America. He's making wonderful films and very interesting films, but they're about bravery, they're about courage, they're about in a Western setting. You know, the West gives it a kind of backbeat or something like that. But I don't think it's about the process of American colonization of, you know, the land. So here I think Melville, he's not really saying, well, I'm making a film about the resistance. It's a film about a lot of other things that takes place during the resistance. So that's why exactly what you said isn't in the film. You know, there isn't that whole thing about, you know, this is what we're struggling against. Look what the Nazis just did. We don't get any of that. Now, some of it, again, might be a kind of shorthand. The French know about that. But there is, I think, a reluctance to get into the details of it. And that's why, for me, it's almost like the resistance as a state of mind, as opposed to a series of military political acts, you know, which it was.
Okay, 2 more questions. One here.
Yes, I had mentioned to Professor Paxton before I'd mentioned to Professor Paxton before the film began that I'm reading the autobiography of Lucille Blas and her husband Ramon. And I just want, you said that you would talk about that because reading that is sort of fleshing out the real resistance, because she tried to, she successfully got her husband out of this prison in Lyon, having confronted Barbie in person. It's really an extraordinary autobiography. I highly recommend it. But maybe you talk a little bit about the connections between the two, because they're both set exactly at the same time.
Well, I did want to mention the role of women in this film, because whereas it's quite true that we're talking about a masculine band here, one of the men in the band is his tough lady, and that's not entirely imaginary. There were women, very senior women in resistance. There was a woman named Marie-Madeleine Fourcade who ran a whole resistance network, and then there was, of course, Lucy Aubrac, who did liberate her husband. The easy one was they knocked over a van that was transporting him from one prison to another. And then she talked him out before they identified him. They didn't know who he was. But there'd been a few holes knocked in Lucy Aubrac's story in some of the details. But nevertheless, she was one of the very powerful women in the French resistance, and they played a huge role, much of it smuggling radios and sheltering people and so forth, but some of it in command positions, and I think that's worth mentioning. I didn't quite answer your question, but I took it as a chance to reflect on the fact that one of the tough guys in this masculine group is a very tough lady.
Last question. Did you have your hand up?
I wanted to ask if the story of Mathilde was in part based on Lucy Aubrac.
Oh, okay.
So,
Okay, then you have the last question.
I want to ask Professor Paxton about his own experience in film with Claude Chabrol's Diario Vichy.
Well, that's also not related to this.
But it's
to this.
the other side.
Pardon me?
It's the flip side of history.
Well, okay.
As
Well,
opposed to Gaullist
for those of you who don't know, Claude Chabrol decided to make a film which consisted entirely of picking footage from the German newsreels, which was what everyone saw if you went to the movies in France during the war. And you went to the movies, and incredibly often in France during the war, because it was the only place that was warm. So his plan, I think, was a good one. This is what a great many French people saw, and how they formed their view of the war. It's called The Eye of Vichy, L'œil de Vichy. It has been very powerfully attacked by all sorts of people. One attack was that there wasn't any explanation, and some people feared that the German propaganda newsreels were so beautiful that everyone would go marching off with their arms up. But Chabrol was convinced that the sordid reality in these newsreels would be self-evident. The other criticism, which was not so much advanced by the public because it wasn't so visible, he mixed German propaganda with Vichy propaganda. And Jean-Pierre Azima and I, who were the two historical consultants, kept saying, Monsieur Chabrol, that one is German and that one is Vichy, and maybe we should make some distinctions. Oh no, he said, this is dramatic footage, I can't do without it. He was really looking for dramatic footage, and some of it is quite wonderful, and but there is this the problem in it. I would sum up by saying it was slightly frustrating because he didn't take our advice. But it was a fascinating experience.
Thank you so much to all of you for coming. Please join me in thanking Professor Paxton and Professor Peña.